So let's talk about the weakest and weediest units from every army in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd update one of the videos on the channel from a year or so back, go through every single faction in the game, and talk about which unit I think is perhaps struggling the most out of each and every one, and a few other honourable mentions. I think it's sometimes interesting to look at some of the units that are struggling most in the Codex, as potentially ones that Games Workshop might want to buff at some point in the future. Obviously lists like this are a little bit arbitrary. Obviously you can't really directly compare damage dealers versus buffing units, and a lot of units are just either outright bad, but some are just kind of never going to be taken because they're flatly redundant to something else in the codex. For each army I thought I'd just select one choice and then talk through a few other of the near misses, just to give a bit of an overview of which units I feel are struggling most in each codex. As for other rules, I think I will be sticking to the codexes themselves in this video. Forge World units, I say, have a much higher tendency to get just made completely redundant or underpowered, and I thought that just making the entire list into a list of obscure Forge World technology would be a little bit useless. In any case, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the choices. I'll give my reasons for each one, but if you think anything else should really have been taking the centre stage, please let me know down in the comments. We'll start with the Imperial factions and then move through to Chaos and Xenos. First up, we'll start with the Space Marines, the single codex that has the most options to choose from, with a whole load of redundant options, which is almost guaranteed when you've got 90 plus datasheets. With the sheer amount of options on offer, it's kind of hard not to make a fair few of them pretty redundant. The choice I've gone for in the top spot is the Hunter, though I think you could have persuaded me on a fair few of the others as well. The Hunter is the Space Marine anti-air tank that fires the Sky Spear missile. It costs 110 points, and admittedly its defense isn't too bad at toughness 8 and 11 wounds for that cost. The problem with this thing is that it's really specialised to fighting air, and I'd argue not even all that good at killing aircraft compared with other options. Aircraft do appear from time to time in 40k, currently maybe things like Harpies and Ork planes are some of the most common, though they're far from something that you'd expect to run into in every army. If you get unlucky and you don't match up against an aircraft heavy army, then you only get a single, essentially las cannon shot at strength 9, AP -3 and damage d6, utterly dreadful for 110 points worth of tank, though if you are fighting against aircraft then you get an extra 6 damage and +2 to hit them. Despite sounding kind of impressive, it still only averages around 4.5 wounds per turn, if you do account for the fact that it might fail to hit or wound, and it's also super swingy, you get all or nothing, and the Stalker does a bit better against the majority of flyers. All on top of being a non-core gun platform choice means that I think that people are very rarely ever going to want to take one of these. That being said, I think I could have easily selected a fair few other choices for Space Marines. They do really have quite a lot of things that are just outclassed by other units. Land Raiders might have got a little bit better with Armour of Contempt, though I still think that they're kind of underwhelming and they're kind of flawed in the way that if you trundle them towards the enemy, then you might have to fall back and sacrifice their shooting. Predator tanks and Firestrike turrets also fall into the category of non-core firepower that's just inferior to things like Eradicators, and perhaps some of the most niche infantry options are Assault Marines and Reavers, very much struggling to compete with things like Vanguard Veterans among all the other Space Marine elite and troop choices. If we take a look through a few of the major chapters, I thought we'd take the ones that were a bit more divergent from the codex, as they've actually got a fair amount of choices. For Blood Angels, I do find a fair few of their characters a bit underwhelming, though I'd say probably the Baal Predator is perhaps the most redundant. Similar kind of issues to the standard Predator tank, lackluster firepower and defense, and not making any use of the Blood Angels' powerful assault tactics. For the Dark Angels, I'd argue that most of their datasheets really are quite good. Maybe if I had to pick one, then the Deathwing Champion feels a bit redundant. I'm not necessarily saying that he's actually all that bad, he can swing pretty hard with that Halberd of Caliban. But if you are playing a Deathwing heavy army list, I think I'd be taking just about all the other choices before I wound up picking this guy. You can have Apothecaries to revive your very tough Terminators, great psychic powers and litanies to get more out of them, or even things like Master Lazarus can give you a nice protection against mortal wounds, not too bad in current 40k. I just feel like a guy who does fighting and little else isn't going to get the nod most of the time. For the Space Wolves, I picked the Storm Wolf Flyer Transport. This one's 280 points, and it's the more transport-orientated version of the Flyer, rather than the Storm Fang gunship, which actually hits with a fair few more guns, like the Storm Raven gunship, which isn't particularly strong for the cost either. It just puts an awful lot of points in a relatively fragile Flyer, that could potentially be taken out by one round of shooting from certain big threats in 9th edition. I just don't think that the damage or the transport are really enough to justify it. Otherwise, as with the Reavers, I do feel like the Hands of Morkai are a unit that aren't going to get played very much either. Basically expensive Reavers that are quite good against Psykers, but you're certainly not guaranteed to be playing Psykers every game, and the buffs that they get against them I'm not sure are actually meaningful enough to make them a massive threat in games when you are facing heavy Psykers. For Deathwatch, I think there were a fair few units that I was struggling between. There's a lot of stuff that's meh, but most of it isn't really outright bad, I think. Other definite possibilities were the Corvus Blackstar, though I do feel it's probably a little bit stronger than the average Space Marine flyer, and the Kill Team Cassius squad, which unfortunately is just completely locked to fixed gear, which I think is a big weakness when compared with all the other Deathwatch flexible kill teams. I decided to choose Chaplain Cassius himself in the end though, as while I don't think he's really terrible for 95 points, he just feels flat weaker than say just doing a Master of Sanctity and taking that Wise Orator Warlord trait, as rather than just get one Litany cast on a 2+, you get 2, and you don't really have to pay all that many more points. I just can't really see you wanting to take this guy apart from fun and fluff reasons. Finally, for the majorly divergent chapters, we have the Black Templars. For them, I've decided to go with the non-Primaris version of the Crusader squad, 180 points for 10 initiates at base, who, perhaps in fairly classic Games Workshop style, now just compare absolutely horribly with the Primaris version of the same squad. Just 1 point more per standard Crusader to get an extra attack and access to transhuman physiology, and the Neophytes are also massively better as well, hitting harder and having 2 wounds, again just for a few points more. Otherwise, I do feel that the new Primaris Sword Brethren are kind of on the weak side as well, hitting fairly hard in combat, although I think a little bit expensive for their defensive profile compared with other options, and they are forced into a slightly eclectic mix of gear. Jumping away from Space Marines now, we come to the Guard, and pretty much as it's been since the Codex came out in 8th edition, the Death Strike missile is still sitting in pride of place, I think. 120 points for a big nasty cruise missile that might well never fire. On turn 2 it's only going off on a 6, and on turn 3 it's only going off on a 5+, a problem that's got even worse by 40k's game turns going down to only 5. Even if it does fire and the opponent's actually bunched up a few units, you might still only get something like 8 to 10 mortal wounds out of it, and it's often just going to be far too little far too late to actually affect the game. You're definitely better with things like a Basilisk or a Manticore, which might be able to chip off important models from turn 1, and this thing just really needs a rules rewrite. Otherwise, I think there's plenty of other struggling units within the Guard Codex. I find Commissars are in a bit of a sad place at the moment. 9th edition perhaps isn't too punishing to Guard morale, so they feel a bit on the redundant side. Ogryns just really aren't anywhere near worth their 25 points for what they do in damage and defense, and the Baneblade chassis lineup is vastly overshadowed just by standard Lehman Russes. Paying the same points in Lehman Russ bodies will generally do you far better than piling it into a super heavy. I feel that out of those, maybe the Hellhammer is one of the particularly expensive and not so great value examples, though I think it's kind of hard to argue that any of them are really all that good. Sisters of Battle next, I've gone for Aestrid Thurger and Agathe Dolan, the ones with the auto reliquary standard. Sisters have a massive roster of support characters, and I feel that this pair might well just be the weakest out of any of them. Their main trick is just to give you one turn of an aura of all your sacred rites being on all at once. In theory, it does give your nearby squads 6 different special rules to play with, though it's rarely as good as it sounds on paper, as I think you'll struggle to use most of them at the same time. Otherwise, it's not really all that much. They give you 1 reroll for a nearby character fighting, save a command point, and do a little bit of fighting in melee with a damage 2 sword, though I think they need to be a good 20 points or so cheaper to really be competing with the others. Elsewhere in the Codex, the tank's still kind of underwhelmed compared with the core fire support choices. The Castigator and the Exorcist still just aren't really very good despite their points drop. The Battle Sanctum has its own fortification issues, and I'd argue that its Miracle Dice mechanic is now less important than it was before, as you get a bunch more free ones. And just with the new Armour of Contempt changes, I feel that Penitent engines are now significantly weaker than Mortifiers, as the Mortifiers get Armour of Contempt and the Penitents do not. On to the Custodes, and it's hard not to point the finger at the Venerable Land Raider out of these. Land Raiders, as before, might be a bit of a recurring theme throughout this list, their main issue being that they trundle towards the enemy with a whole load of expensive guns, have the chance of having those guns locked up and made kind of useless shooting at chaff infantry or something, but if you decide against trundling them forward, then they generally aren't the best gunline option either, and other things will be stronger. The Venerable Land Raider does hit a little bit better, hitting on 2s and getting a 6+ feel no pain, but it is the unfortunate Land Raider that's the only one that doesn't have Armour of Contempt, which is pretty massive on a 2+ armour save. I'd say the biggest problem is that its transport capacity just isn't really all that much use. The Custodian Guard are really tough and happy just moving and advancing to where they need to be. They just don't really need a Land Raider to get them there. For a few of the other weaker choices, I feel that the Alaris Custodian Terminators have had what little balance they had kind of shattered. They already felt a little bit behind the Custodian Guard now, they've really got a lot less interesting, and the same can be said of the Wardens as well. They lost both objective secured and also their bodyguard protection thing, so aren't quite as vital to have around for characters. Elsewhere, the Vigilators, the Sisters with the Great Blades, they just feel like they're in a bit of an unfortunate army, as the rest of the army does high strength damage to high AP melee attacks pretty well, and is also really survivable. And within the HQ section, things like Blade Champions, Alea and the Knight Centura maybe don't compete so well with things like Shield Captains and Trajan Valoris. For the Grey Knights, I think again you could look at Land Raiders or the Space Marine Flyers once more. I guess their Land Raiders do at least get Armour of Contempt, so I think you could quite easily say something like the Storm Raven gunship might be one of the weakest models in the entire army, though it does kind of feel a bit more like a Space Marine unit that's been ported over to Grey Knights. While I might be tempted to put one of the Flyers maybe as one of the weakest things for Grey Knights, just because they don't really fit in all that well with the army's synergies or strategy, if I did have to pick one of their actual unique units, I might be tempted to go for Brother Captain Stern maybe. It's not really all that bad in himself, a fairly standard Brother Captain in Terminator armour. I just feel that his special abilities for being a special character aren't really all that exciting. An extra little buff against demons if you get him really close, and a potentially quite damaging reroll mechanic where if you use them for him, your opponent gets to make a reroll anywhere in their own turn, which could be on something far more powerful. Probably the main reasons that I think is largely never going to get played though is that he's locked to the Ward Makers, so just one of the Psychic Brotherhoods, and you don't get any Warlord trait or relic flexibility with him, and that's a really big advantage for the more generic HQs. To be honest, I feel like the Brother Captains in general are kind of overshadowed by the Grandmasters and Dread Knights, Librarians, and maybe even Drago. That's fairly low down on the pecking order, and he's fairly low down on the pecking order within Captains. Otherwise, for HQs, I think that Brotherhood Ancients, Grandmaster Voldus, and regular Grandmasters again struggle to compete with these other options. And for actual battle line units, I think perhaps the Purgation Squad is one of the weakest actual Grey Knight infantry units. Their base damage output and special weapon spam isn't really all that terrible, but Dread Knights just kind of do it better on the move, and the stratagems that seem designed to make the Purgation Squad an interesting option are a bit too much on the pricey side. Sticking with the knightly theme, we go into the Imperial Knights. At time of recording, this has only just come out, so it hasn't exactly had all that much playtesting from the community yet. Though if I had to gamble on one unit that I don't think will be seeing as much play, it would probably be the Knight Valiant. I felt like they were already in a slightly questionable place before. They did get a boost to their armour save, though most of the rest just isn't really great news. Most of the weapons save the harpoon kind of stayed the same. They're locked out of a fair few of the good relics and things. Their movement's been nerfed to 8 inches, which is really quite meaningful on a platform that's got very short ranged guns, and on top of that, Titanic Feet's got nerfed as well, meaning that this guy who usually wants to be charging forward towards the foe is kind of very bad in melee right now. My guess is that most people will tend to go with other options. Finally, for the Imperium, we have the Inquisition and Imperial Agents. I think the Assassins are all generally okay for what they bring, and pretty much all the Inquisitors have at least one niche which they can fill a bit better than one of the others. So perhaps the worst units would fall on their support units, the Acolytes and the Demon Host in particular. I think overall I'd give the dubious crown of worst unit to the Acolytes. You can get some interesting buffs and synergies going with the Inquisitors, but they do remain 10 points per model for basically a Guardsman's stat line. The special weapons that they can equip are also kind of expensive, and just to fill them in the first place you need to take an entire Inquisitorial detachment, so it'll break army-wide special rules like combat doctrines. I suppose if you are bringing one of those detachments along, then the single one-model 10-point Acolyte unit is kind of interesting in just an annoying little thing to park on objectives, but I can't say I'm massively convinced. As well as those, I don't really think that the Demon Host is all that much better. 25 points for a close range and melee threat, though coming in single model units, I don't think they're usually likely to achieve all that much, unless heavily supported. Moving on to Chaos next, and of course the Chaos Space Marines do have their new codex coming out in the not too distant future, and as with just about every other power armoured army, Land Raiders and Predator tanks are probably worth a mention on the weak unit list. Otherwise, for more unique stuff for them though, I feel like the Noctilith Crown is quite underwhelming. 85 points for an aura of 5 plus invul and a bit of psychic denial. Maybe not the absolute worst thing in the world, though it does encourage you to castle up. And with Armour of Contempt, those invuls actually got a little bit less value, as you've got a bit less chance of reaching them. Perhaps the other really strong contender for one of the worst units are the Fallen. They're perhaps one of the units in 40k that have had their rules most neglected over 8th and 9th edition, basically just a copy paste of a few Dark Angels rules from 8th, and not really able to use any decent synergies within the Chaos Codex. It's just kind of hard to imagine a role for them that you'd want to fill in game that at least one other unit didn't do better. For the Death Guard, just like the other Marines, again Land Raiders and Predators are worth a mention. Both of these seem particularly quite bad to me in Death Guard. Adding an extra armoured hull between the enemy and the Death Guard doesn't really seem all that necessary, compared with just getting more very tough bodies on the objectives. Predators also, I think, particularly lose out, seeing as the Plague Burst Crawler is a choice for Death Guard, and it basically just does the same as a Predator, but better in every way. Otherwise, within the Codex, again a few of the other generic choices don't really stand out that much. The standard Chaos Lords maybe seem a little bit worse than the unique HQs, though I guess they could be just kept cheap for buffing purposes. And compared with the other Demon engines, I don't really feel the Defilers are all that stand out. Maybe if I had to pick an actual Death Guard unique unit, I might be tempted to mention the Noxious Blightbringer. I feel perhaps he might be the most underwhelming out of the entire Feat of Virion setup. He mainly gives a movement buff, though even he can pick up a potentially interesting no falling back relic to hopefully trap an enemy in combat for a crucial turn. For the Thousand Suns, we'll just give one last shout out to Land Raiders and Predators. I guess in theory the 5 plus invul could help the Predator a little, but again even that's been made a bit less relevant due to Armour of Contempt. Out of the unique Thousand Suns choices though, a fair few things do stick out. I must admit I'm really not the biggest fan of the Mutalith Vortex Beast. It is fairly tough, and it does do a bit of mortal wounds and melee, though it still just feels very lackluster for the points to me. Despite dominating the start collecting box, Zangors I think are in a rough place as well. If you just want cheap expendable chaff for grunt work and screening, Cultists will do that with less points investment, and their damage and synergies just don't tend to be strong enough to actually make people want to get them, at least compared with rubrics and scarabs. Finally, and perhaps slightly sadly, an honourable mention is probably worth it for Magnus himself. Unfortunately, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns very rarely ever makes it into competitive lists. At 450 points and an okay but not stellar defensive profile, you could easily lose a lot of value if he gets targeted down early. If you are playing the sort of opponent that you can keep him alive against, I think he can potentially do some serious work, though you still have to play pretty aggressive with him, as you can't really have 450 points just sitting on the bench. On to Chaos Demons next, and as an 8th edition codex, it is one that's got really quite a lot of holes, a fairly big roster of units, particularly in the HQ section, but very few of them are really in any way strong. Perhaps one of the single worst might be the Blue Scribes for 90 points, as they're just one among many of a ridiculously contested HQ slot that has no less than 35 HQ datasheets. I think you could certainly argue that they're one of the very worst. 90 points to manifest a random Tzeentch spell that's not guaranteed to be useful or in a useful position to go off, and then a fairly weak and easily avoidable bit of psychic denial that your opponent could potentially just move out of the way of if they have a psyker that's in any way fast. Combine that with basically doing no damage and being super fragile, then these two just don't really look like they're going to be forwarding Tzeentch's schemes to any great effect. With the Demons Codex though, I think there's plenty of other candidates. Just a few of the options might be the Spoilpox Scrivener. 100 points is just very expensive to throw towards trying to make Plaguebearer melee work. The Soul Grinder, despite its points drop, is still fairly underwhelming as a damage dealer hitting on 4s. Tzeentch's Burning Chariot still doesn't have all that much damage and is fairly fragile at toughness 5 and 8 wounds. And maybe out of the Slaanesh ones, the Infernal Enrapturous isn't that great. A one-shot anti-tank weapon with that harp, and some psychic shenanigans that might help against certain armies that go very heavy on them, though you're likely to have a fair few denies going round as demons anyway. There's probably a fair few more that I could mention for the demons, to be honest. They badly need a new codex. Finally, for the ranks of Chaos, we have the Chaos Knights. Again, like the Imperial ones, really quite a new codex, though I'd say, unlike the Valiant in the Imperial one, the choices maybe seem a little bit more balanced. Perhaps the main reason for that is that the Knight Tyrant datasheet both covers the Valiant and the Castellan builds, and I feel that the Castellan is at least a little bit better than the Valiant on paper. I still feel like the Knight Tyrant might be one of the weaker choices though. They are locked out of a bunch of relics again, and have to pay more for quite a lot of the demonic upgrades if you want to take one. Otherwise, as a Knight's Codex, it doesn't really have all that many other datasheets, and I'd argue that most of them are fairly well balanced. The Rampager and Desecrator both hit on 2s, and it just depends whether or not you want more attacks or a big gun. The Abominant I think is a fairly standout one, being massively tanky. The Despoiler is the flexible one to tailor to your needs for a big knight, and then all the War Dog classes seem to have a good role to me, and have access to fairly decent buffs throughout the book. I found it quite hard to pick a weakest datasheet for Chaos Knights, so let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Xenos time now, and we'll start out with the Craftworlds. Out of the new Eldar Codex, most of the units did get a bit of a glow up, though perhaps slightly surprisingly, just like the previous edition of the book, the troops I think really do stand out as a bit of a weak slot. I've chosen the Corsair Void Weavers as perhaps the weakest unit in the book, 100 points base as a troops choice, and I feel that they might be even less use than the Void Scarred, which you can take as an elite's choice, as they can take an interesting mini cycle within the unit and potentially be sitting around capping an objective, and also potentially just using that cast to farm out command points each turn. For the troop slot ones, they are the most expensive unit that you can get at minimum size. They don't really have significantly better damage in my opinion, and being Corsairs they don't get Craftworld attributes or all that many synergies throughout the rest of the book. Otherwise, the next unit I might be tempted to mention might be the Storm Guardians. In theory at 80 points, they're at least one of the tougher troops choices for the cost, but despite that I wouldn't really rate them above the Rangers or the Guardian Defenders. I'd happily pay the extra 1 point for the Shuriken Catapult, which makes the unit a lot more dangerous than the Storm Guardian's Blades, I think. Next up we have Harlequins. They've got a very small unit pool, and even after they've been toned down a bit since their codex dropped, I still think that all their units remain very usable indeed. Surprisingly enough, I might actually argue that the Void Weavers might be one of the weaker units in the codex now. They used to be insanely undercosted at 90 points, but then bumping them up by a massive 40 points put them all the way to 130, and now even with all their tricks to jump around and stay safe, they feel a bit more passable and not really the main strength of the codex. I think all the other Harlequin units also remain pretty solid. Maybe the other two that might be vying with the Void Weaver for one of the bottom spots though are probably the Solitaire or the Sky Weavers. The Solitaire is a really fun, fast moving and hard hitting melee character, but maybe just one of the least important compared with the rest. I think that the Sky Weavers are still decently powerful and maybe a bit underrated, but still probably a bit weaker than mass troops and Star Weavers. Onto the Drukhari next, and after a couple of rounds of nerfs, I feel a fair amount of the codex is at least fairly well balanced, without really any units truly standing out as being incredibly weak. I still argue that maybe the Beast Packs and the Beastmaster are some of the most redundant units in the codex perhaps. I think the actual beasts are all kind of interesting on their raw stats alone. They don't get any of the fancy buffs of the rest of the army, but their numbers are quite impressive, but they do require a Beastmaster tax and to try and keep them in line with leadership, which I feel does kind of ruin their efficiency a bit. Otherwise, I'm still not particularly sold that Lilith Hesperax really competes all that well with a tooled up melee succubus with a relic and a warlord trait. I feel you could easily field 2 fighty succubi before you'd really want to field Lilith. Genestealers next. I think the vast majority of their actual fighting units do have decent purpose. I feel like their weaker and less taken units are the characters that don't really see play all that much, just because again, like many of the other armies, they have a vast roster of characters, and it's just never really going to be efficient to take them all. The Clamorous has changed into the character that basically does objective things. His Scrambler array does a bit of deep strike denial, which can be kind of annoying for certain factions, and he can support cult units to shoot while doing actions, or get an unreliable chance to cancel Obsec on certain enemy units. I'm just not really too convinced that it's worth the 50 points to include him though. For 50 points you could get yourself another unit of Acolytes, so maybe you could have a unit that comes down and does an action while the other one shoots or whatever. Then after that's done you've actually got a unit that's kind of threatening on the table, rather than some guy with a big speaker who doesn't really do too much in combat. Some of the other ones that I'm not too crazy on are the Jackal Alphas, a bit of a shooting buff and sniping, though not really that great for the points I think. The Locust is cheap and fairly fighty, but his bodyguard ability was toned down recently in the nerfs, and the Abominant feels like a character that you might want to take along if you had Aberrants, and Aberrants aren't considered to be one of the powerhouse units of the Codex in the first place. Sticking with forces of the hive mind, we come to the Tyranids, obviously a really strong codex at the moment, though I think perhaps one of the most flat out bad units in the book are the Spore Mines. They cost so much that it seems clear that Games Workshop kind of wants you to spawn them in with other Tyranid beasts, rather than actually buy them in with points at the start of the game. There's quite a lot of different ways that you can spawn them in for free, and if you do buy them with a 10 point per model price tag and got truly terrible defense, they don't screen properly or block enemy movement for models. They're kind of unlikely to catch the enemy in the first place unless they actually walk straight into them, and even if the enemy does obligingly do that, the damage isn't really all that great for the cost. It's very possible that the unit just explodes all over an enemy unit and then does less points cost damage than the points that you paid for it. It's maybe a fairly similar story with the Mucolid spores. I feel like of the two, the Mucolids are maybe a little bit better to buy with points than the Spore Mines, though not significantly better. And then just within the Tyranid Codex, there's quite a lot of units that I'd say aren't really bad, but just are kind of overshadowed by other choices. Lictors don't really seem that great when Death Leaper's on the table. Hive Crones seem pretty bad when you've got the Godly Harpy swooping around. The Broodlord and Trigon Primes struggle against the other HQs. Termagants underwhelm against Gargoyles and Hormagaunts moving fast with Obsec. And Ripper Swarms got heavily nerfed in the new book. They don't really do that much damage. They aren't Obsec and are moved to the fast attack choice, and they're kind of good for just being cheap movement blockers or area screens and not really very much else. Necrons next, and despite a points drop, the Obelisk still is looking as underwhelming as ever. 330 points for a super heavy vehicle with very bad damage output, okay durability, but then all the disadvantages of being a Lord of War, like badly interacting with terrain and costing you more command points. It's 330 points worth of model that could be ignored for a fair few turns, and with the massive damage characteristics of some of the weapons in 9th, it might not even be the hardest to kill either. Otherwise, for underwhelming units within the Necron Codex, Death Marks do some fairly mediocre sniper damage. I think Trazyn the Infinite is perhaps one of the weakest special characters that you can take along, not really competing well with Overlords that you can take your own choice of Warlord traits and relics for. And their fortification network, the Convergence of Dominion, it's very tough, but again it just sits there and doesn't really contribute to the battle all that much. For the Orks, they've really been struggling with Codex internal balance since their book dropped. Quite a lot of datasheets just seem like you wouldn't really want to run them compared with similar things. Maybe the most underwhelming of everything is their fortification, the Mechboy Workshop. Fortifications have their deployment issues, it gives you a small repair boost, and then a couple of benefits to getting custom jobs, all of which I just can't ever really see helping more than just including something like another buggy. Elsewhere in the Codex, there really is quite a lot of other stuff that underwhelms. Zogrod Wartsnagger's fluff sounds fun as someone who leads super grots into battle, but in reality they don't actually do all that much different from standard Gretchen. Captain Badrock doesn't face up to most other Orc war bosses as a good damage dealer. The Nob with the War Banner can be kind of good to buff some non-core choices and make their melee better, but provided you've actually got core units to buff, then you may as well have a war boss that actually fights well as provides the same buff. The gun wagon I think easily isn't worth the extra points on top of the regular battle wagon, and out of the planes perhaps the Blitzer bomber is one of the worst. Its damage output just feels so lackluster compared with the Dakar jet and the Wasbomb blaster jet. Last but by no means least, we come to the Tau Empire, and maybe in a slightly common theme, it is another fortification again that I feel is probably the least useful unit in the Codex, and those are those Tide Wall fortifications. They function like clunky transports that you can load fire warriors into and fire out of as they move up, but they don't actually add you any speed, and often what you want out of them is to use something to catapult them onto objectives, which Devilfish do superbly. If we did discount fortifications and things though, I'd say maybe the Razor Shark and the Sun Shark are some of the most underwhelming sources of firepower in the army. As they're flyers, they're not going to do objectives, and compared with the fair few of the quite strong flyers that Games Workshop have released in Codex recently, these guys feel like they've missed the mark. Otherwise, I don't think sniper drones are particularly good in terms of damage output, though I guess they could be okay sitting on objectives with their stealth field. Overall, there are rather a lot of units throughout 40k that I think could use a bit of a buff. I definitely feel like some of the codexes do a lot better to make most of their units at least somewhat usable, where a few of them kind of miss the mark quite badly. I certainly look forward to hearing your thoughts though down in the comments below. Let me know what you think is the worst unit for your army and what you might do to improve it. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.